everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Feingold, back with the weekly lectures. I missed last week because I was in Las Vegas at the National Open, but now I'm back. So today's lecture is sponsored by Dara Murphy. Thanks for sponsoring our lecture. If you would like to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife Karen. Her email address is karen@atlchessclub.com, and you can sponsor a lecture about whatever you want to sponsor a lecture about. Now, of all the grandmasters and great players of the past that I've done, Ziatdinov may be one of the less famous. And somebody who knew him was worried on Twitter that maybe he passed away because of the name of the lecture, but he's still alive, which I explained to him. But the reason he's a great player of the past is his best chess was in the 80s and 90s, and this is 2024, and that's why you haven't heard of him. He's originally from Uzbekistan, and at the time, nobody called it Uzbekistan. They just said he was part of the Soviet Union. I guess if you lived in Uzbekistan, you might say that. So he was a Soviet chess player, and then he moved to the US, although it doesn't say when he did. Based on my experience, I think he moved to the US in the 90s, although I could be wrong. And the reason I say that is when I lived in Belgium from 1988 to 1992, I saw Ziatdinov at tournaments in Europe. I never got paired with him in Europe. However, I did play him in the World Open. I think it was a little more than 20 years ago, but I don't remember when. And I've seen him at dozens of US tournaments in the last 30 years. He doesn't play very much anymore. However, if you'd like to play Ziatdinov, then you can see him Untitled Tuesday. He plays almost every week. So he's playing chess on chess.com, but he doesn't play over the board very much at all anymore. But still plays more than I do, which is I don't play at all. His Wikipedia article is harsh because it mentions he lost to a 10-year-old last year in some chess festival, or 2 years ago. Although it's not much of an upset now losing to a 10-year-old. If I beat a 10-year-old, that would be an upset. And it says he lives in Irvington, New York, currently, which I haven't heard of. I've heard of New York. And he was Uzbek champion in 1983 and 1985. And let's see, that would be 40 years ago, and he's 65 now. So that was around his peak, somewhere around there. And he was awarded the GM title in 2005. And most of the time, when I saw him at chess tournaments, he was an IM, but I was always wondering why he wasn't a GM, because he was obviously GM strength. And here's his player profile on FIDE, where you can see his picture and his FIDE ratings, and the fact that he's a grandmaster and such. So a lot of times when I do a lecture on somebody, the main reason I pick some games over some other games is because you guys, I want you to have heard of the people that he beat or that she beat. So I won't show you a game, great players of the past, where the great player beat somebody rated like 1800. I'll show you where they beat Karpov and Kramnik and Kasparov and Anand and Fischer and that kind of thing. That way you're like, wow, that guy was a great player of the past. Okay, this time I did something slightly different, although still strong players, but I did something that I thought was more interesting. Ziatdinov being 65 means he played chess in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s, and I wanted to show a game from each decade. I thought it was more likely when I started this project that I would show a game that he played in the 1970s than 2020s, but I was wrong. And I could have shown a game he played in the 70s, but I thought it was more interesting to see a game that he played last year, since he would have been 64 years old at the time. Okay, so the first game is against Sergey Dolmatov, and this was played in 1983. So Ziatdinov was pretty good in 83, although his career, compared to Dolmatov's career, Dolmatov was a candidate for the World Championship. Dolmatov was clearly in his peak, like top 20, top 25 in the world. So beating Dolmatov with black is pretty impressive, because Dolmatov probably between 85 and 92 was at his peak. And this was played in 83 when he was very good. This was played in the former Soviet Republic's team championship. This was in Group 2. Okay, and Ziatdinov liked to have black and double king pawn. And lucky for us, they played crazy two knights variation. And at the time, this variation was crazy like a fox. But since this game was played, now it's crazy like Fox News. Fox News exists in 1983? I hope not. Okay, so black played d5, which is what they play now. And then knight a5 is the move all grandmasters play. Lower rated players will play knight takes d5, which is a mistake. Or they'll play b5 because b5 has a funny name and is funny looking. And they hope that their opponent doesn't know any theory and they win quickly. But okay, knight a5 is what the grandmasters play. They played the main line, which is this. And in this position, at some point in the 60s, everybody played knight f3. And there's a famous game from Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games where he wins by playing knight h3. And then people started playing that a little bit. So knight h3 is probably almost equally common to knight f3 currently, although this position doesn't occur very often. But if you want to see like a Fischer game where he wins with white, then you can look at My 60 Memorable Games, and this is one of his games. Okay, bishop d6, d4, e4, and you might be wondering, white played knight h3, but Ben didn't explain why the knight's on h3. Well, if the knight's on f3, then e4 attacks the knight, which is that's the main line, and the knight keeps moving. But now the knight has the f4 square, pretty good square. And you could argue, I don't understand this position, isn't white just a pawn ahead? And I would tell you white's development isn't very good, and black's bishop has lots of places to go, and the knight on a5 isn't very good at the moment, but my bishop and my knight are good and I can castle. And it's black's turn to move. So black has compensation for a pawn. Queen c7 threatens the knight. He defends the knight. And then castles c4, which makes sense. g5. And I think, if you do nothing with black and sort of play boring, you'll be down a pawn. So if you want compensation for the pawn, you have to play aggressively. The knight fianchettos itself, bishop h3, castles, and rook d8, putting the rook on the same file as the queen, something I've been talking about in chess classes and lessons my whole life. When a rook is on the same file as an opponent's queen, that's good for the rook. Okay, bishop e3, defending the d pawn again. Then knight h7. The obvious reason to play knight h7 is to play f5, f4, which would give black a crushing position. Knight d2, f5. Now, if black could just play f4 here, then he would be winning. So white plays c5, attacking the bishop. And if we look at the previous couple of moves, If white played c5, we could just take on c5 because the d-pawn's pinned. So that's why white played knight d2. Now the d-pawn's not pinned, the knight's blocking. So bishop went back to e7. Once again, I think if I had black, I might try to play f4 next move. So b4 attacking the knight. The knight goes back because it had nowhere else to go. And finally, white doesn't have any threats he can make, which stop f4. So he stops f4 by playing f4. Makes sense? Knight back to f6. The knight has the juicy d5 square. G4 is no slouch either. Bishop c4 check. King in the corner. Knight b3. Knight g4, threatening to take the knight on g2. And then after king takes, knight takes e3 check is a super fork. Okay, first recommended in 1983 by Rick James. So white didn't like that. So white defended the bishop on e3 again. a5, playing on the queen side now. a4, white agrees. And a5. White sacrifices his pawn back to get a passed a pawn. Rook a8, a6, and the knight goes to d8. So white's not a pawn ahead anymore. White has a passed pawn on a6. Black has a passed pawn on e4. And the position's really wild and crazy. I wouldn't know who's better by just looking at the game. Position's too wild. Bishop to d2, attacking the b4 pawn. Queen d7, ignoring it. So white takes it. And then bishop f6, putting pressure on the weak d4 pawn. White defends it. Rook b8, attacking the bishop. Bishop moves away. And knight e6. So black has tremendous pressure on the d4 pawn, and black has a nice open file for his rook. And black has the initiative, and once again, white has an extra pawn. Black just gave his pawn back on b4 to get open file for his rook. d5, and now all heck breaks loose. Okay, d5 is the kind of move which makes me want to quit chess again, because I don't want to calculate this for either side, because everything's hanging. And that's not my specialty. Now, in white's defense, whether or not d5 is a good move, probably he was afraid of knight c7, knight d5, and then black's position looks pretty good. The center pawns are completely blocked, so that extra pawn doesn't really help white at all. So he must have calculated that this was good. Knight takes c5, very sharp, complicated move. And I'm guessing if I was a betting man, and since we'll never know, I could say anything I want, probably white missed that, because it looks like the knight's just hanging. Trades the bishops, and he takes on g5. If he takes the knight, and it looks like black just blundered a piece, black can play queen a7, and funnily enough, there's no way to protect your knight, because the knight on g4 is protecting f2 and e3, so the queen can't defend. So instead he took on g5. Then he played knight to d4. Black took, and rook takes f5. Super complicated with everything hanging. Rook takes, knight, and then a7. Could take with the knight also. Rook a8, and then he takes with the knight. So if you're keeping score, and it's hard to do because both sides keep giving stuff away and playing super complicated, this position has equal material, strangely enough. The a7 pawn is attacked twice, and the d5 pawn is attacked twice. The bishop can't be captured because of rook takes queen. However, the knight can be captured, and I assume white was considering rook takes d5 in that position. Okay, and that's what happened. Rook takes d5, and then queen f6. And unfortunately, black doesn't need to directly protect his knight, because if we take the knight, then queen d4 check is check, and can't save the rook. So white played queen f1. White says if I trade queens, then the knight's hanging, and this a7 pawn might be good. Queen b6. White's king is terribly placed on this diagonal. There's a lot of black pieces near the white king, so Ziatdinov doesn't want to trade queens. He wants to play knight discovered check and just checkmate white. Queen a1 check, king h7, and that's the end of the checks. I mean, you can check and hang your queen or your rook, but queen d4 looks good. Queen b1 check. Always play bishop f1, and rook f8 attacks the bishop on f1, which would be mate. So rook d7 check, knight takes rook, king g6. White's playing for perpetual, but that's the end of the checks. And after rook f6, even though white can queen, black is threatening queen takes f1 mate, and black is threatening rook takes queen also. So there's no defense here to everything, or to anything. So white resigned. So that was a very typical kind of two knights because it was so complicated. And I like when, in this situation, Ziatdinov was the lower rated player and the less famous player. And he didn't win because of a one move blunder. They played a very complicated tactical game, and Ziatdinov was better in the end. And I think based on the games I looked at and based on my game with Ziatdinov, he liked those kind of tactical positions where it's a big fight. That's good for the spectators. Okay, next game.
I had a question on that last
I have an
position.
answer.
Why can't you just take the rook there and queen?
Then I have to go back.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, let's see. Let's go to the end. We're going to do it with the extra special way, although this way doesn't make any sense. So in the final position, one of our customers wonders, why doesn't white take the rook, and then when black takes, we promote to a queen? That's an excellent question. First of all, I didn't see that move, but I think in this position, black would take with the king, and then after queening, we would play queen b6 check. Although to be perfectly honest, I don't see like an easy way to crash through here. Although I'm guessing bishop takes knight check must win, but I don't see how it wins. Let's see. Knight f2 check normally would just end the game. Let's see. So I can play knight f2 check, knight d3 check, bishop takes check. You can never take with the bishop because you get mated. And if you take with the king, then queen f2 check. And then I take your bishop with check. You'd have to do this. And then this I can win. I think this is just mate. In fact, I think I could have mated without taking the bishop. Oh no, my queen was on f2. So I have to play queen f3 and then mate on f2. Although if you don't like that mate because you have something against it, then I could play this mate. And if I don't play mate, I'm still winning because I'm up a piece. And in fact, I don't see another way to win. Probably an engine would. But that's pretty forced. King takes queen, queen b6. I mean, you could play knight e3, but that's not going to help you. And then knight discovered check, takes, and then bishop takes. This is going to be mate, and king takes. This is going to be mate, and wins a piece. So that answers your question. Although that wasn't easy for me. That was actually pretty complicated. So I think that reminds me, don't play chess again and always use the engine. I mean, for me. For you guys, play chess all the time and never use the engine. Rawr. But good question. Okay, next game is against somebody more famous, Tony Miles. And I've lectured about Tony Miles before. He was one of the 5 best players in Great Britain for about 25 years. He died very young. I think he was 46. And I've played him several times, actually. And this game was played in 1990. And the reason this game was played in 1990 is my goal for the lecture is to show you a game that Ziatdinov played in every decade. First game was from the 80s, and this was played in the 90s. Once again, Ziatdinov is black. What's funny is the one game that I beat Tony Miles had the same opening as this game. This is also my game with Tony Miles from 1988, except my bishop was on g4. Otherwise, everything was the same. And in this position, I played bishop g4 earlier, so he played knight d2, and I played bishop d6 and queen e7. Okay, but he played a5, which I also played against Miles. And now if somehow Ziatdinov could cheat and play bishop g4, that's my game with Miles. I just played that before I played e6. Okay, so Ziatdinov played knight a5, knight c5. He wants to play a4 and mess up white's pawn structure. So Tony defends the pawn. Bishop d7 is pretty passive. And b5, and I actually played a5 and b5 as well. Although the way Ziatdinov does is a lot safer than what I did, because my bishop was over here getting trapped, and here the bishop is defending all the white squares. So this is a safer way for black to play a5, b5. Takes. Black gets the half open, the open file for the moment. And it looks pretty equal. I don't see a big advantage for anybody. Nothing much is going on. Just maneuvering their pieces. And finally, Miles does something. He plays d3, d4, kicking the knight away. And now he plays queen d3. He wants to play c takes d, which unleashes an attack on the knight on a6, which currently is unprotected. So queen b7, protecting the knight, as well as attacking the bishop on b2, b1. And Miles does something else again. He plays c5. And that takes away the pressure from the center that white had on the c4 pawn. So earlier in the game, white had pawns on d3 and c4, and he had pressure on the center. Now he has pawns on d4, c5, which gives him more space, but takes away the pressure on the center, so black can move his pieces a little bit more, not worrying about the d5 pawn. Attacks the a5 pawn. And knight c7 defends the a4 pawn by moving the knight out of the way, and the knight can go to b5, which is a good square. Defends the a pawn again. And finally plays knight b5, attacking a3. And he plays e5. And again, with the pawns on d3 and c4 for white, black is never playing e5. And this is the negative of putting your pawns up here, is sometimes e5 is a good move, as it is here. So now white's pawns are getting attacked. They're not really causing black any issue. White sacks the exchange, probably based on the theory, always sack the exchange. But I think white's position was getting bad because my bishop can go to f6. I can get the two bishops if I want. d4 is going to be weak. And he decided the exchange sacrifice gave him a good position by taking on d5. So now white will eventually have two connected pass pawns in the center, and white has a nice bishop on d5. On the other hand, black has a rook for a bishop and pawn, or knight and pawn. So rook to f8, defending the f7 pawn. And white has the two pass pawns, and bishop e6. This is strategically an excellent idea. Black would prefer that white trade here, giving black, I should say, the open f file, and the d4 pawn isn't passed anymore. So black could start a blockade on the white squares with queen going to c6 or d5 or f3. So white would prefer like moving the bishop away and then playing pawn to d5. So played knight c3, rook d8. He wants him to take on e6, and he does. If he doesn't take on e6, then the d4 pawn is not defended. So now white only has one passed pawn, and the d4 pawn's pretty weak. But he got 2 pawns for the exchange, temporarily. Now everything white has is attacked. The knight and the d pawn. And he played queen c4, queen c6, blockading. And in this position, if I was white, I would seriously consider knight to d6. And after this, I would seriously not consider knight to d6 because the c pawn is pinned. So now you can't take here because your queen's hanging. So I like the move queen c6 a lot for black. And basically white can't do anything here. So white is moving around, but white's just moving backwards. Now the d pawn is very weak. And it's a terrible position for white. White is just defending. And then he plays brilliant move e5 with the obvious idea, if you take it, then rook here check is very annoying. And by very annoying, I mean it's mate next move. So that's pretty annoying. So he plays d5, try not to give black a passed d pawn. Now rook d1 is still annoying. And now black's just up too much material. White doesn't really have any compensation. Black's threatening queen f1 mate. Black wants to play rook c2. Now black wants to play queen takes f3. And here, Miles played queen h1, which isn't really a nice way to defend f3. But if you have a better way, h5, the white king is trapped. And f4 is a blunder, although I don't have a suggestion as what move to make. Resigns. And then queen d7 check. So a very quick end for white's king. And really nice outplaying Miles, who was a much higher rated player, much more famous in this tournament, and winning with the black pieces. Ziatdinov, very dangerous player. And it looked like Miles was trying to take control of the game, but eventually he lost control and everything just fell apart. Okay, next game is against another famous player, especially in America, Igor Ivanov. And for a long time, Ivanov was the strongest IM in the world and should have been a GM, of course. This was played in 2000, so now we're getting to the 2000s. 10 years after the previous game. Ziatdinov was white. Igor Ivanov was black. And they played Open Sicilian, which is probably Ziatdinov's favorite opening with white. They transposed to a dragon. And in this position, I think Igor started to go wrong, but actually the game got really interesting. He played knight g4, which I don't like, but maybe that's just me. And although black has the 2 bishops, white is starting the attack first. He plays f6 to keep his 2 bishops. White starts to attack. And Igor doesn't castle because he wants to attack on the queen side. And finally, he defends f6. And he sacks the exchange. I think that's a good move. I think if we take on f6, black's bishops have very strong attacking chances after rook b8. And it looks like black's going to have, full compensation for an exchange here, if not just winning. So he played h5, ignoring the rook, trying to get his own attack. Bishop a2, a move you don't see very often in the dragon. Takes. He finally does take the rook. And then rook g1. So both sides are getting checkmated. So the arbiter had to stop the game because it was too exciting. Okay, so bishop f7 defends the pawn on g6 and threatens queen a1 check which would be winning for black. So Ziatdinov makes a run for it, king d1. And he knows he's going to have his attack with queen h6 coming. He just wants to make sure he doesn't get mated. Rook b8, I think that's too slow. Knight e2, white wants to trade queens and not get mated. And I think in this position, black should be okay by trading queens and taking on b2. And then probably the engine will say something like equal, because it always does that. But I think black should be fine there. But Igor played for more. Queen a1 check. Still wants to trade queens. And he says, I don't want to trade queens. I'm going to mate your king. b3, blocking everything, blocking all of black's attack. d5, trying to open the center. And now white plays a typical move when your opponent plays d5, trying to open the center, plays e5, keeping the center closed. And now white's attacking. So black's rook and bishop were doing a good job attacking, and now they're not. And now white's threatening knight takes g6, which just wins the game. And that's not easy to stop. So I think the last three moves, Igor messed up the position. I'm sure he was fine. It was super complicated. And now it looks like he's in trouble. Rook b4, knight takes g6, rook d4 check. And, you know, it looks silly for white to run his king out in the center. On the other hand, the black's king looks even sillier. So looks like white's king is actually safer than black's king. Bishop takes, check, king f7. And when Igor took on g6, I'm sure he missed this move. He probably thought the white rook would move away and the black king would be somewhat safe by running, over here somewhere where it's blocked by, black has good defense. And then white's king can start getting attacked, queen here, check. But I guess he just missed the next move. So if you want to find a brilliant win for white, you can pause your video. And the move is rook h7 check. Now in this position, black has to play king e8. And black is still losing because black doesn't really have a threat here. If it was black's move, I don't have a good suggestion. So I would guess rook e6 is pretty winning, threatening everything. Probably even rook takes c6 is winning because that stops queen a6 check. That's black's only check. Black's up, white's up in exchange, and black's king doesn't look very good. But king e8 is forced. He took the rook, which for somebody of that level is pretty bad defense. I mean, you don't take the rook if you see that white's mating you. And so I guess he didn't see white was mating him. Maybe he's in time trouble. Okay, queen h6 check, king f5, and I guess he didn't see that white's mating here. And then after the next move, Ivanov was like, oh, white's mating here. So the game only went one more move. And these moves are hard to see, which I tell my students all the time. It's hard to see retreats. Probably spent a lot of time looking at rook f7 check and thought that was fine. But queen h5 check is not fine. Now black has three legal moves. Okay, this one allows mate in one. So that's not good. This one gets mated more than one way, but this mate in two is pretty easy. There's probably other mates that I missed. And the third way of playing is to go here, and then after I check, you have two legal moves. King d6 gets mated, and king d7 also gets mated, and then you can play queen mate, or if you're mean, you can play here and then play your choice of mate in ones or twos, but queen e8 mate probably would be played. So after queen h5 check, it's clear all king moves lead to mate, so Ivanov resigned. And psychologically speaking, like in this position, if my opponent goes here, I'm going to assume that king takes rook loses, otherwise, why is my opponent doing that? Then I would calculate and make sure, and then when I was sure, but I would assume, then I would play king e8 and hope that I can, I guess there's no hope, but I'd hope anyway. Gotta hope for something. So that was a nice like dragon kind of game because white tried to attack, then black tried to attack, and then white broke through with a sacrifice and won the game. And again, as I said earlier in the lecture, that was Ziatdinov's kind of style. And because of his style, he beat a lot of higher rated players because he put a lot of pressure on them. Okay, next game is from the 2010s. And now Ziatdinov is getting lower rated because he's getting older. And he's playing Yungou, who's about 2,500 FIDE. And once again, it was a double king pawn. They played a main line of the Spanish Ruy Lopez kind of thing. Okay, this is the main line. And he played the Breyer variation, which has been around for about 140 years. The idea is to fianchetto your bishop and put your knight on d7. That's the idea. Hundreds and hundreds of grandmaster games in this position. One of the main lines. Very closed, maneuvering, not much happening. Good for an older guy. Okay, nothing's been traded. Nothing's happening. Now the h-pawn's attacked. He defends it. Still nothing has been traded. h4 gives away the g4 square, so he takes it. And finally, we see a trade on b5. He takes with the c-pawn, which opens up the queen and the bishop. C-pawn was blocking them both. He has this nice knight on g4. White closes the center. Black gets the two bishops. Looks like a good Ruy Lopez so far. Typical Ruy Lopez. Takes. Both sides are getting what they want. And now white plays the tactical move, knight takes e5. And I think I never would have shown you this game if white didn't, I don't want to say go crazy, but play like super interesting tactically and then having it backfire. So the point of this move is that the queen is overworked. So if I take the knight, you'll take the bishop, and my queen was defending my rook and my bishop. So white wins material this way. And if black doesn't take the knight, well, that's the problem that white had, is I think it actually helps black that this pawn is gone. It makes my bishop better. It makes my queen better. And before that, these pieces are pretty passive. So I think by not falling into white's trap, this actually helped black. So black played bishop c8. Now black is actually threatening to take the knight because the bishop's not attacked. And then black sacrifices the exchange and plays knight g4, and black's pieces are monsters. I mean, this bishop is amazing. This knight is amazing. I have rook f8. I have queen h4. I mean, black's pieces are coming to life, and white has this bishop on a4. Terrible. So that's funny. Like, probably black didn't see knight takes e5, and probably white didn't see that black would ignore it and then get a big attack because the e5 pawn's gone. So basically, the truth hurts. Okay, the queen has to move because the queen's attacked. Rook f8, threatening the f2 pawn. Never play f3. Knight e5, and now white has perpetual weaknesses on the dark squares, since all of white's pawns are on white squares. And black has a dark squared bishop, and black has a queen on the dark color diagonal. For those of you who like tactics, black is threatening rook takes f3, and then if you take it, knight takes wins the queen. So he played f4. The knight went back to g4. Now we can play queen h4 later. f5. Queen e5, threatening everything. Queen c5 check, and queen takes knight. Rook b3 defends the knight. Knight f2 check. Bishop e5. And if it was black's move, black is incredibly threatening. Knight takes e4, which is totally crushing. White tries to trade queens. And black says, yeah, whatever, you can trade queens. I'm playing knight takes e4. And in this position, white played queen takes queen to try to get out of this attack. White could also take the knight on e4, which is probably what I would do. And then that's too complicated for me. But one funny variation is I take, and I'm threatening rook h5. And rook h5, now that's a threat. You can argue with me about my analysis, but you can't argue about rook h5. Rook h5 is a serious threat. So I don't know what the evaluation of this position is, because rook f4 is also winning. And probably white was in time trouble, so he probably didn't like this. So he thought if he traded queens, then everything would be fine. Knight takes, and knight takes bishop on a4. And in this position, black has two pieces for a rook, and black has a problem. Problem is rook b1 to b8. That's a problem. And black has other problems like these two pawns. And white has this permanent problem of this pin, and you can't escape the pin. So black is doing well materially. White is doing good with passed pawns, but black is doing good by pinning the knight on g3. So what am I telling you? It's too complicated for me. I retire from chess again. So white played rook b1 to b8 as I recommended, and black put the knight on e4 to try to win the knight on, got rid of the passed pawn first, h5. Actually, I thought black was going to play knight here, but black found a better way to play. And then h4. And there was nothing to do about h5, h4. There's no way white's king could escape. So white won the piece on g4, black won the piece on g3, and when the dust settles, black has two pieces for a rook. Black is also going to win this pawn. The knight can save the a pawn, and white's just dead lost. But he didn't resign. He played on. This is a resignable position. There's nothing white can do. And eventually white decided, like, man, that's a pretty strong pawn. So here white resigned, which was correct. Good time to resign. Amazing game. I'm sure if you look at it with an engine, with a fine-tooth comb, because the fine-tooth comb could get the dust out of the engine, you'll find some mistakes that game, but that's a pretty exciting game. And we see that Ziatdinov, often with white and black in super exciting games, can beat higher rated players. Now, we won't be done because I didn't show you a game from the 2020s. So I showed you games from the 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010s, and 2020s. There's very, very few people that I could show you games from 5 different decades. And this game was played 40 years after the first game I showed you. This was played in India, and Ziatdinov's rating was lower, but he still beat a higher rated player. And if you look at the game, you would just think white is a normal grandmaster and not somebody who's 64 years old, who isn't as strong as they were 40 years ago. It seems like he's that strong. So that means occasionally, even though you're not as good as you were in your 20s, even in your 60s, sometimes you can just pull it out and crush your opponent just like you always did. That's what this game reminded me of. I thought of like, man, white's just a better player than black. And I was like, wait a minute, white's not as good as he used to be, but sometimes you can still play. And they played an open Sicilian. This is actually my game with Ziatdinov. I had black. Went like this also. Put it in H. Plays very aggressively. Bishop d2, same diagonal as the black queen. Trades queens, and white gets in e5. White's still playing aggressively even after trading queens. And white still plays aggressively. Now white's threatening bishop takes h6. Bishop g5. So I guess the idea is if you take, I take with check. And then if you go here, I play here. And now rook h8 check is annoying. And if you move your f pawn, so your king has f7, I just play g6, and your king doesn't have f7. And then I'm going to play here next move. So he didn't take the bishop on g5. Actually, bishop g5 is less of a tactical move than a positional move. White wants to trade dark squared bishops, so white can play knight d5 or knight d6 or knight takes c5. And since the bishop was defending both of those, bishop g5 is a good move. Okay, so he ignored it, and Ziatdinov said, thank you for the pawn. Basically, Ziatdinov now magically turned into Magnus Carlsen. White's up a pawn, and, I wouldn't say white's better otherwise, although white's up a pawn. I wouldn't say white has other advantages, just extra pawn. And he won like it was nothing. So basically perfect technique. Another tactical trick. F-pawn is overworked. And gets into this pawn up endgame. Very nice play by white, making things look easy. Still up a pawn. Not enough compensation. Makes his bishop strong. And his extra pawn is on the queen side. So eventually he moves up on the queen side. Better bishop, better king, Papa John's. And just black doesn't really have any counterplay. Now in this position, white is winning, and here black blundered. But okay, I mean, black is going to eventually lose because when the knight moves over here, which it has to, white's eventually going to play king d4, c4, c5, and it's going to be a win. Black decided to lose as quickly as possible. He played knight h4. And after he played knight h4, he resigned before white made a move. So one move for white wins incredibly quickly, and he didn't even wait for white to play it. Knight on the rim, better for him. So pause your video if you're watching on YouTube and try to find the move that incredibly wins. If you're watching live on Zoom, you could chime in and say, this is the move white should play. That'll see if the people on Zoom are listening. White has a move and the game's over, and black actually resigned before white played it. Because if he plays it, it's too embarrassing. Anybody?
Well, I'm looking.
I actually played almost the same move against somebody like 30 years ago, and they resigned. It was the same, almost the same idea. So I've seen this before.
Is king f2?
That is correct. Our viewers are the smartest.
Trap?
Yeah, you can unpause your video. Yeah, king f2. Yeah, black resigned, but after king f2, now he could resign again. The only way to avoid losing the knight is to go here. Now, white can win by taking the knight and winning the king and pawn endgame, or white could win the same king and pawn ending this way, and black has to play king here to keep my king out, but I'm going to do this. So the king can't go in both directions, so resigning is a good idea. Otherwise, I'm gonna win this way, or I'm gonna queen. It's up to you. So after king f2, the game's over. I win the king and pawn ending, and that's if black finds king e7 f6. If he doesn't find it, then king at g3 just wins a piece. So black resigned after king f2. And that was a very Magnus-like game for somebody who's 64 years old, who obviously isn't in their peak, but who has in fact won FIDE-rated games in 6 decades. I didn't show any games he won in the 70s because this is a 45-minute lecture, not a 45-hour lecture. And it just goes to show you there's lots of lesser-known GMs who, at their best, beat a lot of famous, strong players. They played well into their 50s and 60s and can still win occasionally against very strong players. Thanks again to Dara Murphy for sponsoring a lecture. I'm Grandmaster Ben Feingold. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.